Before we begin the video, please subscribe to our channel Noble Paw Tales. A golden sunrise spilled across a winding country road, stretching through empty hills and dry grasslands. The air was cold, still holding the breath of night, and the only sound was the quiet thump of worn boots against cracked earth. Thomas, 72, walked with a slow, steady pace, each step deliberate. His gray coat hung loosely on his thin frame, catching in a breeze. A cane in his right hand helped keep rhythm with his gait. Beside him, Compass walked close, his thick black and tan fur catching glints of morning light. His ears twitched at every sound, birds, wind, a distant crow. He stayed alert, scanning the road ahead, never straying far from Thomas's side. They had been walking since dawn, but the road felt longer than it had ever been. It wasn't a route on any map. It was personal. One Thomas had promised himself he'd walk again before the end. Not for adventure, not for escape, but for something older. A return, a promise. Compass glanced up often, checking on Thomas. The dog didn't need a leash. He never had. Since he was a pup, he'd followed Thomas's every move. Years had changed them both. Compass had grown into a strong, loyal companion. Thomas had grown older, quieter. But they remained together, always together. Thomas's hands, calloused and shaking slightly, adjusted the strap of his pack. Inside, among a few essentials, was something far more important, a small wooden bird, smooth from years of handling. He kept it in the inside pocket of his coat, where it rested against his heart. The road dipped and climbed, broken in places by tree roots and stones. Every incline slowed Thomas more. His breath grew shorter. The cane tapped more often. But he didn't stop unless he had to. Not yet. He hadn't spoken much during the walk, but when he did, it was to Compass. "Good boy," he muttered, as the shepherd paused to let him catch up. Still sharp. Compass's tail moved slightly, a silent reply. He stayed within reach, always matching Thomas's pace. There was no one else on the road. No passing cars. No fences or signs. Just hills, dry grass, and an endless stretch of sky. In the distance, the faint outline of a forest could be seen. Somewhere beyond those trees, the village waited. The one Thomas had left 40 years ago. The one he had promised to return to. He remembered often stone houses, narrow paths, the big willow tree near the riverbank. Most of all, he remembered her, Clara, the only person who had ever fully understood him. Her voice had faded from memory, but her presence hadn't. He could still feel her hand in his, the way she looked when she smiled, the way she pressed the wooden bird into his palm all those years ago. "If we're ever apart," she had said, "bring this back to our willow tree." He hadn't then. Life had moved quickly. Work, responsibility, time lost to routine. They had moved from the village. New places. New worries. Then, 5 winters ago, Clara had passed, quietly in her sleep. And suddenly, the promise came back with force. He hadn't forgotten. He had only delayed. Now every step was about that promise. Not for closure. Not for peace. Just for love. Simple, strong, and quiet. The sun rose higher, and the warmth faded quickly behind the wind. Thomas stopped to rest by a large boulder, leaning heavily on his cane. Compass sat beside him, close enough to touch. They stayed that way for a minute, just a man and his dog on a road no one else cared about. After a moment, Thomas pushed himself upright again. He touched the pocket where the bird was. "We're getting close," he said softly. Compass looked up, ears perked. Then they kept walking. The road ahead bent slightly to the left, disappearing behind a slope covered in dry brush. Thomas walked slower now. His right knee ached with every step. The wind had picked up, and the warmth of the sun was no longer enough to keep the chill off his bones. Compass walked just ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure Thomas was still upright, still moving. He didn't bark or whine. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. As they moved, Thomas's mind slipped into memory, not as a distraction, but as a companion. That's how it often was when the road grew quiet. The past would walk beside him. He remembered the village clearly. It sat at the foot of a hill, a collection of weathered stone houses with gardens full of wildflowers. The paths were narrow, and the roofs all seemed to tilt at the same angle, like they were leaning in to listen to the stories of those who lived beneath them. And in the center of it all stood the willow. It wasn't just a tree. It was a place of promises, of beginnings. He could still see Clara there, sitting beneath the branches, her back against the trunk, a small carving knife in her hand. She had always been good with her hands, delicate, patient, steady. That day, she was shaping a small bird from a piece of cedar, a sparrow, the kind that used to nest near their window. They were young then, full of hope, still building a life. Compass was just a pup back then, all paws and energy. He'd run in circles around them, tripping over roots, chasing bees, barking at butterflies. Thomas remembered how Clara had finished the carving, then handed it to him. "If we're ever apart," she said, "bring this back to our willow tree." He hadn't answered right away. He didn't need to. They understood each other in silence. That sparrow had stayed with him ever since. Through every move, every job, every quiet dinner and loud argument, every hospital visit, and finally, through the long silence that followed Clara's death. When she passed, the house felt cold for weeks. Compass had sensed it. He never left Thomas's side. Sometimes, the dog would sit by the door, ears perked, waiting for footsteps that would never return. After Clara's funeral, Thomas took the sparrow out of its drawer and placed it in his coat pocket. He didn't know why at first. He wasn't thinking of the promise. He just wanted something of her close. Years passed. Friends stopped calling. The neighborhood changed. Compass aged but stayed strong. The house grew quieter. And then, one morning, Thomas stood up, looked around, and realized he wasn't waiting for anything anymore. The only thing left to do was to go back. Back to the village. Back to the tree. Back to the place where love began. He hadn't told anyone. There was no one left to tell. He just packed a bag, filled a canteen, placed the wooden sparrow in his coat, and began walking. Now, as he crested the next hill, he paused and looked back at the road behind him. It was empty. No cars. No footprints. Just Compass, sitting patiently, waiting for his next step. Thomas reached into his coat and touched the sparrow again. Its edges had softened over the years, smoothed by time and handling. But the shape was still there. The wings, the beak, the care Clara had put into every line. "I'm keeping my promise," he said aloud. Compass stood and wagged his tail once. That was enough. Thomas adjusted the strap on his shoulder and stepped forward again. Each footfall was slower, heavier, but certain. The past didn't weigh him down. It carried him. The willow wasn't far now, and neither was she. The sun had shifted past noon, but Thomas didn't notice. His legs were heavy. Each step dragged more than the last. The road had turned cruel, steeper, rougher, broken by roots and stones that caught underfoot. The wind cut harder here, sweeping across the hills with a chill that sank into his joints. His breath came in short bursts, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own body. Compass moved slower now, too, not from age, but awareness. He kept closer, never more than a step away. When Thomas paused, Compass paused. When Thomas stumbled, Compass nudged his leg gently, grounding him. Thomas stopped by a twisted tree, its roots curling out like fingers. He leaned against it, his chest heaving. His cane slipped slightly, and he caught himself just in time. "Just a minute," he whispered, unsure if it was to Compass or to himself. He looked down the road they'd come from. The sky behind them had begun to gray. He felt it deep in his bones, the weight of time. Not just the years, but the journey itself. He'd pushed too far, and he knew it. As he sank to the ground, slow and careful, Compass let out a low whine and sat beside him. Thomas fumbled for the inside of his coat, fingers brushing the carved bird. He pulled it out just to see it again. "We're almost there, boy," he said. His voice was dry, barely above a whisper. But the road didn't care how close they were. His body was failing. His strength had run out. The sparrow slipped from his fingers, falling to the dirt. Compass tensed. Something in the dog changed, ears forward, posture alert. He pressed his nose to Thomas's cheek. Thomas didn't flinch. His eyes had closed. Compass let out a soft, urgent whimper. Then he stood. No command was given. None was needed. He turned and ran. Compass ran like he never had before. His paws hit the dirt hard, kicking up dust as he bolted down the narrow road. Muscles that had stiffened with age now moved with purpose. The world blurred past, shrubs, stones, trees all reduced to flashes of color and shape. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Thomas had never needed to call him, not once in all those years. But now Compass ran because Thomas couldn't. The road forked near a line of trees, and Compass veered right without hesitation. His ears were pinned back, his mouth open as he panted through the run. Every part of him burned, but he didn't slow. Ahead, the hills leveled out, and nestled at the base of a slope was a small, crumbling chapel. Its roof sagged under the weight of time, ivy climbing the stone walls like silent hands. No lights, no sound. But Compass knew. He let out a sharp, urgent bark. Once, twice, 3 times. The noise cracked through the still air. Nothing. Then, movement. A figure stepped into view from the side of the chapel. A young man in his late 20s, with a worn jacket and work boots, squinted toward the road. His name was Elliot. He'd come to the chapel looking for quiet, not expecting company. Certainly not a German shepherd barreling toward him with wild eyes. Compass skidded to a stop just in front of him, barking again, short and forceful. Elliot stepped back, startled. "What is it?" he asked, glancing around. "What's wrong?" Compass lunged forward and grabbed Elliot's sleeve, not to bite, but to pull. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Elliot hesitated, but there was something in the dog's eyes. Fear, urgency, purpose. All right, show me." Compass released his grip and turned, bolting back the way he came. Elliot followed, breaking into a jog, then a run, trying to keep up with the blur of fur leading him across the hills. The road felt longer on the return. Elliot stumbled once, nearly twisting his ankle, but Compass didn't stop. His pace never broke, even when his legs trembled. Finally, after nearly 2 miles, the bend in the road appeared, the gnarled tree just beyond it. Thomas still lay there, slumped against the roots, his face pale, body still. Elliot dropped to his knees. "Sir, can you hear me?" Thomas didn't answer. Elliot felt for a pulse. Faint, but there. He grabbed a flask from his bag, uncapped it, and pressed it gently to Thomas's lips. Compass stood beside them, panting hard, his sides heaving. His eyes never left Thomas's face. "Come on," Elliot said quietly. "Don't go now." After a few tense seconds, Thomas's fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered, barely open. His gaze moved slowly, unfocused at first, then fixed on Compass. "You came back." His voice was dry and hoarse. Compass stepped forward, nudging Thomas's chest with his nose. Elliot looked down and noticed the small wooden bird in the dirt. He picked it up and placed it into Thomas's hand. Thomas gripped it weakly, eyes closing again, but this time with relief. "You're not alone," Elliot said. The wind settled. The only sound was Compass's breath and the creak of the tree above them. Elliot pulled off his coat and draped it over Thomas's shoulders. Then, gently, he helped the old man sit upright. "Let's get you home." The walk back to the village took 3 more days. Thomas couldn't walk on his own anymore, not really. His legs had given everything they had on that hillside. But Elliot didn't ask questions or make speeches. He simply helped. He crafted a makeshift stretcher from canvas and walking sticks. Compass stayed close, alert and protective, never straying more than a few feet. He slept with one eye open, his body curled near Thomas, listening to every breath the old man took. They camped under open skies. No tents, just blankets and the cold truth of the earth beneath them. Elliot kept a small fire going. He didn't speak unless Thomas opened the door first, and even then his answers were short, kind, and quiet. That was all Thomas needed. On the second evening, Thomas finally broke the silence. "I was supposed to die there," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "By that tree." Elliot didn't look up from the fire. "Maybe you were." But Compass had other plans. Thomas gave a faint smile, small and tired. He's been with me through everything. Clara loved him more than she loved me, I think." Elliot glanced at the dog, who was curled against Thomas's side, his head resting on the old man's hip. "She must have been special," Elliot said. "She was," Thomas replied. "We carved a bird together once. Said we'd meet again under the willow if we ever got separated." Elliot nodded. No questions. Just listening. The final morning, the sun rose behind them, casting long shadows as they came over the last hill. Below, nestled in the valley like a secret kept safe for decades, was the village. It hadn't changed much. Stone homes with red tile roofs, fences leaning into gardens full of weeds and color. A single narrow road curling like a stream through the heart of it. But what stopped Thomas, what made his breath catch, was the willow. It was still there, tall and wide, with its limbs stretched like arms ready to gather someone close. The years hadn't broken it. If anything, it had grown fuller. Its leaves shimmered in the breeze, whispering memories. As they neared the village, children spotted them first. They ran ahead, shouting toward the homes. Doors opened. Faces appeared, older, grayer, but still familiar. Is that Thomas? Thomas Kearney? My God, after all these years. Elliot didn't stop. He helped Thomas from the stretcher and placed a steadying hand under his elbow. With Compass on one side and Elliot on the other, Thomas walked the final steps. The crowd parted as they reached the willow. No one spoke. Even the children stood still. Thomas knelt slowly, painfully, at the base of the tree. The soil was soft, damp from recent rain. He pulled the sparrow from his coat pocket and looked at it one last time. Its edges were worn smooth, its wings faded. But the shape still held. The memory still breathed. He dug with his bare hands, not deep, just enough. "I kept my promise, Clara," he whispered. Then he placed the sparrow in the earth and covered it gently. Compass sat beside him, his ears forward, head high. Elliot stood behind them, hands in his pockets, silent. The villagers didn't interrupt. They watched with quiet reverence. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply bowed their heads. No one needed to be told what this moment was. Later that evening, they lit lanterns in the square. Neighbors brought out bread, soup, and warm drinks. A few old men brought instruments, fiddles, and an accordion, and played the songs people remembered from their childhoods. The air smelled of wood smoke and rosemary. Thomas sat on a bench near the willow, wrapped in a heavy shawl. Compass rested at his feet, his tail occasionally thumping the ground when someone passed by. Elliot stayed close, speaking with the villagers, but never wandering far. One of the children, curious, unafraid, approached Compass and gently laid a hand on his back. Compass didn't move, only turned his head and licked the child's fingers. Thomas watched and smiled. It wasn't the house he'd once owned, or the bed he'd shared with Clara, or the tools in his old workshop, but it was home. Not because of the buildings, because of the people, because of Compass, because he had done what he said he would. That night, as the lanterns dimmed and the village went quiet, Thomas didn't feel alone. He had come full circle. The road had led him back. Thomas's days had started to blur together. The weathered stone bench beneath the willow tree had become his place of peace, his sanctuary. The villagers had given him space, enough to feel like he was part of the rhythm again, but not so much as to make him feel lost in their gaze. He sat there mostly silent, his back against the tree's sturdy trunk, feeling its ancient presence seep into his bones. His breath was slow now. Every movement required more effort. Every second stretched longer than the last. He didn't complain. He didn't need to. The village, the people, the warmth, they were enough. And Compass, always at his side. Elliot had become more than just a companion. He was a friend. Someone who had stepped into the vacuum left by decades of solitude. Each evening, Elliot would sit beside Thomas, telling stories of his own life, his travels, his thoughts. Thomas listened, often with his eyes closed, but always present. The sound of Elliot's voice had become a familiar comfort, like an old song you hadn't heard in years, but still knew by heart. Days passed, and the inevitable slowed Thomas down further. His legs, once strong and steady, now felt like lead. His chest, which had once expanded with ease, now struggled for air. It wasn't painful, but it was constant. The fragility of his existence was no longer something to be ignored. It was an awareness that lingered in every moment. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low behind the hills, Thomas called for Elliot. The younger man had been busy in the village, helping with repairs on the homes and fences, but he always made time for the old man. Elliot appeared soon after, a smile on his face, though it was tempered by the soft sadness in his eyes. "You needed me, Thomas?" Just stay with me for a while," Thomas said, his voice soft, the words tasting strange on his tongue. It wasn't often he asked for anything, but he felt the need for presence now more than ever. Elliot nodded without hesitation, sitting beside Thomas on the bench. Compass, ever faithful, laid down at their feet, his head resting on Thomas's knee. They sat like that for some time. The wind whispered through the branches of the willow, and the sounds of children playing in the distance were faint but familiar. The air smelled of rain and earth, and for a moment everything felt timeless. A piece of Thomas's heart, a piece of Clara's memory, settled under that tree. Thomas spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen a lot in my years, good and bad, but I think this is the best part." Elliot didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the fading light, letting the weight of Thomas's words hang between them. He'd known this day was coming, but he had never really considered it until now. Thomas had given him a gift, a glimpse into the life of a man who had loved deeply, who had lost much, and who had found a kind of peace in the end. And through it all, Compass had been there. "You're not alone," Elliot said softly. Thomas turned his head, meeting Elliot's eyes for the first time in a long while. "I'm not," he replied. "Not anymore." As the evening settled into dusk, Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the village and the steady presence of his friends wash over him. He could feel the presence of Clara, too. It was in the rustling of the willow leaves, the coolness in the air, and the way Compass leaned against him, still, as though understanding the finality of the moment. The last breath Thomas took was slow, deliberate, as though he knew exactly when to let go. It wasn't painful. It was simply a passing, a soft release, a final exhale that felt like the wind itself, fading into the world. And in that moment, Compass let out a single mournful bark. Elliot froze, his heart clenched in his chest. He turned to Thomas and saw the stillness, the finality that had overtaken him. But instead of panicking or calling for help, Elliot sat quietly, eyes glistening. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The village came quietly to life then. They had seen it, understood it, without the need for words. The elders knew the signs, the younger ones could sense the change. The villagers had witnessed the life of Thomas Kearney in full, his return, his peace. They knew the man, and they respected him. They gathered, not out of sorrow, but out of gratitude. They'd all known him in some way, some from his youth, others from the days of his return. They all knew his story. Elliot stayed at Thomas's side, his hand never leaving the old man's shoulder. For a long moment, the air hung heavy with silence. Then, without saying a word, Compass stood, his head raised high. He looked toward the village, his body poised, alert. A low whine escaped his throat before he turned and walked toward the willow tree. He didn't need to look back. The villagers all gathered around, watched as Compass made his way to the heart of the tree. He stopped at the base, his tail still, his eyes steady. Elliot stood and followed. They were silent as they approached the tree, but when they reached it, Elliot knelt. He took off his coat, and for the first time, he truly understood the bond between a man and his dog. The villagers came to join them, gathering around the willow, forming a circle of respect and remembrance. Thomas was at rest, but his story and the story of his dog would remain in the heart of the village forever. Compass, though his tail no longer wagged, lay at the foot of the tree. As night fell, the stars began to sparkle overhead, their distant light casting a glow on the faces of those who remained. A carved wooden bird, now faded and worn, was buried beneath the willow's roots, a final promise kept. And in the distance, the wind whispered, carrying with it the sound of a familiar bark, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of a promise that would never fade.